On a Chinese screen, Somerset Maugham. 8. The Servants of God. They were sitting side by side, two missionaries talking to one another of perfectly trivial things, in the way people talk who wish to show each other civility but have nothing in common. And they would have been surprised to be told that they had certainly one admirable thing in common: goodness, for both had this also in common: humility, though perhaps in the Englishman it was more deliberate, and so, if more conspicuous, less natural than it was in the Frenchman. Otherwise, the contrasts between them were almost ludicrous. The Frenchman was hard on 80, a tall man, still unbent, and his large bones suggested that in youth he had been a man of uncommon strength. Now his only sign of power lay in his eyes, immensely large, so that you could not help noticing their strange expression and flashing. That is an epithet often applied to eyes, but I do not think I have ever seen any to which it might be applied so fitly. There was really a flame in them, and they seemed to emit light. They had a wildness which hardly suggested sanity. They were the eyes of a prophet in Israel. His nose was large and aggressive, his chin was firm and square. At no time could he have been a man to trifle with, but in his prime he must have been terrific. Perhaps the passion of his eyes bespoke battles long fought out in the uttermost depths of his heart, and his soul cried out in them, vanquished and bleeding, yet triumphant, and he exulted in the unclosed wound which he offered in willing sacrifice to Almighty God. He felt the cold in his old bones, and he wore wrapped about him like a soldier's cloak a great fur, and on his head a cap of Chinese sable. He was a magnificent figure. He had been in China for half a century, and thrice he had fled for his life when the Chinese had attacked his mission. "I trust they won't attack it again," he said, smiling, "for I am too old now to make these precipitate journeys." He shrugged his shoulders. "Je serai martyr." He lit a long black cigar and puffed it with great enjoyment. The other was very much younger. He could not have been more than 50, and he had not been in China for more than 20 years. He was a member of the English Church Mission, and he was dressed in a grey tweed suit and a spotted tie. He sought to look as little like a clergyman as possible. He was a little taller than the average, but he was so fat that he looked stumpy. He had a round, good-natured face, with red cheeks and a grey moustache of the variety known as toothbrush. He was very bald, but with a pardonable and touching vanity he had grown his hair long enough on one side to be brought over the scalp, and so give himself at all events the illusion that his head was well covered. He was a jovial fellow with a hearty laugh, and it rang out loudly, honest and true, when he chaffed his friends or was chaffed by them. He had the humour of a schoolboy, and you could imagine him shaking in all his bulk when someone slipped on a piece of orange peel. But the laughter would be stopped, and he would redden, as it struck him suddenly that the man who slipped might have hurt himself, and then he would be all kindness and sympathy. For it was impossible to be with him for 10 minutes without realizing the tenderness of his heart. You felt that it would be impossible to ask him to do anything he would not gladly do, and if perhaps at first his heartiness would make it difficult to go to him. In your spiritual needs, you could be sure in all practical affairs of his attention, sympathy, and good sense. He was a man whose purse was always open to the indigent, and whose time was always at the service of those who wanted it. And yet perhaps it is unjust to say that in the affairs of the soul his help would not be very effectual, for though he could not speak to you, like the old Frenchman, with the authority of a church that has never admitted doubt, or with the compelling fire of the ascetic, he would share your distress with such a candid sympathy, consoling you with his own hesitations, less a minister of God then than a halting, tremulous man of the same flesh as yourself, who sought to share with you the hope and the consolation with which his own soul was refreshed, that perhaps in his own way he had something as good to offer as the other. His story was a little unusual. He had been a soldier, and he was pleased to talk of the old days when he had hunted with the Quorn and danced through the London season. He had no unhealthy feeling of past sin. "I was a great dancer in my young days," he said, "but I expect I should be quite out of it now with all these new dances." It was a good life, so long as it lasted, and though he did not for a moment regret it, he had no feeling of resentment for it. The call had come when he was in India. He did not exactly know how or why. It had just come, a sudden feeling that he must give up his life to bringing the heathen to the belief in Christ. But it was a feeling that he could not resist. It gave him no peace. He was a happy man now, enjoying his work. "It's a slow business," he said, "but I see signs of progress and I love the Chinese. I wouldn't change my life here for any in the world." The two missionaries said goodbye to one another. "When are you going home?" asked the Englishman. "Moi? Oh, in a day or two. I may not see you again then. I expect to go home in March." But one meant the little town with its narrow streets where he had lived for 50 years, since when he left France, a young man, he left it forever. But the other meant the Elizabethan house in Cheshire, with its smooth lawns and its oak trees, where his ancestors had dwelt for 3 centuries. 9. The Inn. It seems long since the night fell, and for an hour a coolie has walked before your chair carrying a lantern. It throws a thin circle of light in front of you, and as you pass, you catch a pale glimpse, like a thing of beauty emerging vaguely from the ceaseless flux of common life, of a bamboo thicket, a flash of water in a rice field, or the heavy darkness of a banyan. Now and then, a belated peasant bearing 2 heavy baskets on his yoke sidles by. The bearers walk more slowly, but after the long day they have lost none of their spirit, and they chatter gaily, they laugh, and one of them breaks into a fragment of tuneless song. But the causeway rises and the lantern throws its light suddenly on a whitewashed wall. You have reached the first miserable houses that straggle along the path outside the city wall, and 2 or 3 minutes more bring you to a steep flight of steps. The bearers take them at a run. You pass through the city gates. The narrow streets are multitudinous, and in the shops they are busy still. The bearers shout raucously. The crowd divides, and you pass through a double hedge of serried, curious people. Their faces are impassive, and their dark eyes stare mysteriously. The bearers, their day's work done, march with a swinging stride. Suddenly they stop, wheel to the right into a courtyard, and you have reached the inn. Your chair is set down. The inn, it consists of a long yard, partly covered, with rooms opening on it on each side, is lit by 3 or 4 oil lamps. They throw a dim light immediately around them, but make the surrounding darkness more impenetrable. All the front of the yard is crowded with tables, and at these people are packed, eating rice or drinking tea. Some of them play games you do not know. At the great stove, where water in a cauldron is perpetually heating and rice in a huge pan being prepared, stand the persons of the inn. They serve out rapidly great bowls of rice and fill the teapots, which are incessantly brought them. Further back, a couple of naked coolies, sturdy, thick-set and supple, are sluicing themselves with boiling water. You walk to the end of the yard, where facing the entrance but protected from the vulgar gaze by a screen, is the principal guest chamber. It is a spacious, windowless room with a floor of trodden earth, lofty, for it goes the whole height of the inn, with an open roof. The walls are whitewashed, showing the beams so that they remind you of a farmhouse in Sussex. The furniture consists of a square table with a couple of straight-backed wooden armchairs and 3 or 4 wooden pallets covered with matting, on the least dirty of which you will presently lay your bed. In a cup of oil, a taper gives a tiny point of light. They bring you your lantern, and you wait while your dinner is cooked. The bearers are merry now that they have set down their loads. They wash their feet and put on clean sandals and smoke their long pipes. How precious, then, is the inordinate length of your book, for you are travelling light, and you have limited yourself to 3, and how jealously you read every word of every page, so that you may delay as long as possible the dreaded moment when you must reach the end. You are mightily thankful, then, to the authors of long books, and when you turn over their pages, reckoning how long you can make them last, you wish they were half as long again. You do not ask then for the perfect lucidity which he who runs may read. A complicated phraseology which makes it needful to read the sentence a second time to get its meaning is not unwelcome. A profusion of metaphor giving your fancy ample play, a richness of allusion affording you the delight of recognition, are then qualities beyond price. Then, if the thought is elaborate without being profound, for you have been on the road since dawn, and of the 40 miles of the day's journey, you have footed it more than half. You have the perfect book for the occasion. But the noise in the inn suddenly increases to a din, and looking out, you see that more travellers, a party of Chinese in sedan chairs, have arrived. They take the rooms on each side of you, and through the thin walls you hear their loud talking far into the night. With a lazy, restful eye, your whole body conscious of the enjoyment of lying in bed, taking a sensual pleasure in its fatigue, you follow the elaborate pattern of the transom. The dim lamp in the yard shines through the torn paper with which it is covered, and its intricate design is black against the light. At last, everything is quiet, but for a man in the next room who is coughing painfully. It is the peculiar repeated cough of phthisis, and hearing it at intervals through the night, you wonder how long the poor devil can live. You rejoice in your own rude strength. Then a cock crows loudly, just behind your head it seems. And not far away, a bugler blows a long blast on his bugle, a melancholy wail. The inn begins to stir again. Lights are lit, and the coolies make ready their loads for another day. 10. The Glory Hole. It is a sort of little cubicle in a corner of the chandler's store, just under the ceiling, and you reach it by a stair which is like a ship's companion. It is partitioned off from the shop by matchboarding about 4 feet high, so that when you sit on the wooden benches that surround the table, you can see into the shop with all its stores. Here are coils of rope, oilskins, heavy sea boots, hurricane lamps, hams, tinned goods, liquor of all sorts, curios to take home to your wife and children, clothes, I know not what. There is everything that a foreign ship can want in an eastern port. You can watch the Chinese, salesmen and customers, and they have a pleasantly mysterious air as though they were concerned in nefarious business. You can see who comes into the shop, and since it is certainly a friend, bid him join you in the glory hole. Through the wide doorway, you see the sun beating down on the stone pavement of the roadway and the coolies scurrying past with their heavy loads. At about midday, the company begins to assemble 2 or 3 pilots, Captain Thompson and Captain Brown, old men who have sailed the China seas for 30 years and now have a comfortable billet ashore, the skipper of a tramp from Shanghai and the taipans of 1 or 2 tea firms. The boy stands silently waiting for orders, and he brings the drinks and the dice box. Talk flows rather prosily at first. A boat was wrecked the other day going into Foochow. That fellow McLean, the engineer of the An-Chan, has made a pot of money in rubber lately. The consul's wife is coming out from home in the Empress, but by the time the dice box has travelled round the table and the loser has signed the chit, the glasses are empty and the dice box is reached for once more. The boy brings the second round of drinks. Then the tongues of these stolid, stubborn men are loosened a little, and they begin to talk of the past. One of the pilots knew the port first hard on 50 years ago. Ah, those were the great days. That's when you ought to have seen the glory hole, he says with a smile. Those were the days of the tea clippers, when there would be 30 or 40 ships in the harbour waiting for their cargo. Everyone had plenty of money to spend then, and the glory hole was the centre of life in the port. If you wanted to find a man, why, you came to the glory hole, and if he wasn't there, he'd be sure to come along soon. The agents did their business with the skippers there, and the doctor didn't have office hours. He went to the glory hole at noon, and if anyone was sick, he attended to him there and then. Those were the days when men knew how to drink. They would come at midday and drink all through the afternoon, a boy bringing them a bite if they were hungry, and drink all through the night. Fortunes were lost and won in the glory hole, for they were gamblers then, and a man would risk all the profits of his run in a game of cards. Those were the good old days. But now the trade was gone, the tea clippers no longer thronged the harbour, the port was dead, and the young men of the APC or of Jardines, turned up their noses at the glory hole. And as the old pilot talked, that dingy little cubicle with its stained table seemed to be for a moment peopled with those old skippers, hardy, reckless, and adventurous, of a day that has gone forever. 11. Fear. I was staying a night with him on the road. The mission stood on a little hill just outside the gates of a populous city. The first thing I noticed about him was the difference of his taste. The missionary's house, as a rule, is furnished in a style which is almost an outrage to decency. The parlour, with its air of an unused room, is papered with a gaudy paper, and on the wall hang texts, engravings of sentimental pictures, the soul's awakening and Luke filled as the doctor, or if the missionary has been long in the country, congratulatory scrolls on stiff red paper. There is a Brussels carpet on the floor, rocking chairs if the household is American, and a stiff armchair on each side of the fireplace if it is English. There is a sofa which is so placed that nobody sits on it, and by the grim look of it, few can want to. There are lace curtains on the windows. Here and there are occasional tables on which are photographs and whatnots with modern porcelain on them. The dining room has an appearance of more use, but almost the whole of it is taken up by a large table, and when you sit at it, you are crowded into the fireplace. But in Mr. Wingrove's study, there were books from floor to ceiling, a table littered with papers, curtains of a rich green stuff, and over the fireplace, a Tibetan banner. There was a row of Tibetan Buddhas on the chimney-piece. "I don't know how it is, but you've got just the feeling of college rooms about the place," I said. "Do you think so?" he answered. "I was a tutor at Oriel for some time." He was a man of nearly 50, I should think, tall and well-covered, though not stout, with grey hair cut very short and a reddish face. One imagined that he must be a jovial man, fond of laughter, an easy talker and a good fellow, but his eyes disconcerted you. They were grave and unsmiling. They had a look that I could only describe as harassed. I wondered if I had fallen upon him at an inconvenient moment when his mind was taken up with irksome matters, yet somehow I felt that this was not a passing expression, but a settled one rather, and I could not understand it. He had just that look of anxiety which you see in certain forms of heart disease. He chatted about one thing and another, then he said, "I hear my wife come in. Shall we go into the drawing-room?" He led me in and introduced me to a little thin woman with gold-rimmed spectacles and a shy manner. It was plain that she belonged to a different class from her husband. The missionaries, for the most part, with all manner of virtues, have not those which we can find no better way to describe than under the category of good breeding. They may be saints, but they are not often gentlemen. Now it struck me that Mr. Wingrove was a gentleman, for it was evident that his wife was not a lady. She had a vulgar intonation. The drawing-room was furnished in a way I had never before seen in a missionary's house. There was a Chinese carpet on the floor. Chinese pictures, old ones, hung on the yellow walls. 2 or 3 Ming tiles gave a dash of color. In the middle of the room was a blackwood table, elaborately carved, and on it was a figure in white porcelain. I made a trivial remark. "I don't much care for all these Chinese things myself," answered my hostess briskly, "but Mr. Wingrove's set on them. I'd clear them all out if I had my way." I laughed, not because I was amused, and then I caught in Mr. Wingrove's eyes a flash of icy hatred. I was astonished, but it passed in a moment. "We won't have them if you don't like them, my dear," he said gently. "They can be put away." "Oh, I don't mind them if they please you." We began to talk about my journey, and in the course of conversation, I happened to ask Mr. Wingrove how long it was since he had been in England. 17 years, he said. I was surprised. "But I thought you had 1 year's furlough every 7. "Yes, but I haven't cared to go." "Mr. Wingrove thinks it's bad for the work to go away for a year like that," explained his wife. "Of course I don't care to go without him." I wondered how it was that he had ever come to China. The actual details of the call fascinate me, and often enough you find people who are willing to talk of it, though you have to form your own opinion on the matter less from the words they say than from the implications of them. But I did not feel that Mr. Wingrove was a man who would be induced either directly or indirectly to speak of that intimate experience. He evidently took his work very seriously. "Are there other foreigners here?" I asked. "No." "It must be very lonely," I said. "I think I prefer it so," he answered, looking at one of the pictures on the wall. "They'd only be business people, and you know," he smiled, "they haven't much use for missionaries. And they're not so intellectual that it is a great hardship to be deprived of their company." "And of course we're not really alone, you know," said Mrs. Wingrove. "We have 2 evangelists, and then there are 2 young ladies who teach, and there are the school children." Tea was brought in, and we gossiped desultorily. Mr. Wingrove seemed to speak with effort, and I had increasingly that feeling in him of perturbed repression. He had pleasing manners, and was certainly trying to be cordial, and yet I had a sense of effort. I led the conversation to Oxford, mentioning various friends whom he might know, but he gave me no encouragement. "It's so long since I left home," he said, "and I haven't kept up with anyone. There's a great deal of work in a mission like this, and it absorbs one entirely." I thought he was exaggerating a little, so I remarked, "Well, by the number of books you have, I take it that you get a certain amount of time for reading." "I very seldom read," he answered with abruptness, in a voice that I knew already was not quite his own. I was puzzled. There was something odd about the man. At last, as was inevitable, I suppose, he began to talk of the Chinese. Mrs. Wingrove said the same things about them that I had already heard so many missionaries say. They were a lying people, untrustworthy, cruel and dirty, but a faint light was visible in the east. Though the results of missionary endeavor were not very noteworthy as yet, the future was promising. They no longer believed in their old gods, and the power of the literati was broken. It is an attitude of mistrust and dislike tempered by optimism. But Mr. Wingrove mitigated his wife's strictures. He dwelt on the good nature of the Chinese, on their devotion to their parents, and on their love for their children. "Mr. Wingrove won't hear a word against the Chinese," said his wife. "He simply loves them." "I think they have great qualities," he said. "You can't walk through those crowded streets of theirs without having that impressed on you." "I don't believe Mr. Wingrove notices the smells," his wife laughed. At that moment there was a knock at the door, and a young woman came in. She had the long skirts and the unbound feet of the native Christian, and on her face a look that was at once cringing and sullen. She said something to Mrs. Wingrove. I happened to catch sight of Mr. Wingrove's face. When he saw her, there passed over it an expression of the most intense physical repulsion. It was distorted as though by an odor that nauseated him, and then immediately it vanished and his lips twitched to a pleasant smile. But the effort was too great, and he showed only a tortured grimace. I looked at him with amazement. Mrs. Wingrove, with an "excuse me," got up and left the room. "That is one of our teachers," said Mr. Wingrove, in that same set voice, which had a little puzzled me before. "She's invaluable. I put infinite reliance on her. She has a very fine character." Then I hardly know why, in a flash I saw the truth. I saw the disgust in his soul for all that his will loved. I was filled with the excitement which an explorer may feel when, after a hazardous journey, he comes upon a country with features new and unexpected. Those tortured eyes explained themselves, the unnatural voice, the measured restraint with which he praised, that air he had of a hunted man. Notwithstanding all he said, he hated the Chinese with a hatred beside which his wife's distaste was insignificant. When he walked through the teeming streets of the city, it was an agony to him. His missionary life revolted him. His soul was like the raw shoulders of the coolies, and the carrying pole burnt the bleeding wound. He would not go home because he could not bear to see again what he cared for so much. He would not read his books because they reminded him of the life he loved so passionately, and perhaps he had married that vulgar wife in order to cut himself off more resolutely from a world that his every instinct craved for. He martyred his tortured soul with a passionate exasperation. I tried to see how the call had come. I think that for years he had been completely happy in his easy ways at Oxford, and he had loved his work with its pleasant companionship, his books, his holidays in France and Italy. He was a contented man, and asked nothing better than to spend the rest of his days in just such a fashion. But I know not what obscure feeling had gradually taken hold of him that his life was too lazy, too contented. I think he was always a religious man, and perhaps some early belief, instilled into him in childhood and long forgotten, of a jealous God who hated his creatures to be happy on earth, rankled in the depths of his heart. I think because he was so well satisfied with his life, he began to think it was sinful. A restless anxiety seized him. Whatever he thought with his intelligence, his instincts began to tremble with the dread of eternal punishment. I do not know what put the idea of China into his head, but at first he must have thrust it aside with violent repulsion, and perhaps the very violence of his repulsion impressed the idea on him, for he found it haunting him. I think he said that he would not go, but I think he felt that he would have to. God was pursuing him, and wherever he hid himself, God followed. With his reason he struggled, but with his heart he was caught. He could not help himself. At least he gave in. I knew I should never see him again, and I had not the time to spend on the commonplaces of conversation before a reasonable familiarity would permit me to talk of more intimate matters. I seized the opportunity while we were still alone. "Tell me," I said, "do you believe God will condemn the Chinese to eternal punishment if they don't accept Christianity?" I am sure my question was crude and tactless, for the old man in him tightened his lips. But nevertheless he answered, "The whole teaching of the gospel forces one to that conclusion. There is not a single argument which people have adduced to the contrary which has the force of the plain words of Jesus Christ."